The cold Montana wind was a bitter thing, slicing right through Elizabeth Morgan's wool coat. She sat huddled on a wooden bench, watching the tail lights of another train vanish into the blackness. Another train without the face she was desperate to see. She'd been waiting for 12 solid hours. In her gloved hands, she clutched a letter, the paper worn thin from being opened and closed 100 times. The promise was scrawled in a hurry, 3 simple words that kept the frost from creeping into her heart. "I'm coming home." The year was 1876. Elizabeth, or Ellie as everyone knew her, had gotten that letter 3 days ago. It was the first word she'd had in 2 years. 2 years of absolute deafening silence. 2 years since Garrett Quinn rode out of Silver Creek with a team of cattle drivers, his eyes full of promises about returning with enough money to build them a future. He swore he would. But 2 years is a long time for a promise to hold. The station master, a kind old fella named Mr. Holloway, shuffled out of his office holding a steaming mug. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice gentle, "it's well past midnight. Maybe you should head back to town. Come back at sunup." Ellie took the coffee, the warmth a small comfort against the biting cold. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway, but I told him I'd wait." She gave a weak smile. "And a Morgan never breaks a promise." The old man just tipped his hat. "Suit yourself, miss. I'll keep the stove burning for you." He disappeared back into his little office, the only spot of warm light in the whole desolate station. Ellie sipped the coffee, the bitter taste doing little to wake her. Her mind drifted back. She was just 19 when she'd met Garrett. He was 23, a cowboy with dreams as big and wild as the Montana sky itself. Her father hired him as a ranch hand, and within a few short months, Ellie found herself inventing reasons to go to the barn, just to catch a glimpse of the broad-shouldered man with eyes the color of summer sage. The clock on the station wall ticked on, each second an eternity. 1 o'clock in the morning. She paced the platform, her boots making lonely, hollow sounds on the wood. Out in the distance, the little mining town of Silver Creek was fast asleep, completely unaware of her vigil. Her father hadn't been so unaware. When she told him she was coming to the station, he'd just scoffed. "That Quinn boy ain't coming back, Ellie," he'd said, his voice rough. "Men like him are tumbleweeds. They don't grow roots." But Ellie knew better. She'd seen it in his eyes, the sincerity that night behind her father's barn. She could still feel the weight of his hands on her shoulders, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I'll come back for you, Ellie. Wait for me." And she had. She had waited through 2 long years of doubt and fading hope. She'd turned away other suitors, ignored her father's disappointment and her mother's worried looks. She was 21 now. She'd grown from a girl into a woman, all while waiting for a man who had become nothing more than a ghost in old letters. Then, even the letters stopped coming. The silence had been the hardest part. The last train had pulled out at 11. The next wasn't due until dawn. Ellie wrapped her coat tighter around herself, the cold seeping deep into her bones. She would wait, even if it took all night. Sleep finally took her, a fitful, dream-filled sleep of whispered words and the distant thunder of hoofbeats. She was jolted awake by a train whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the pre-dawn quiet. The sky was just starting to turn a pale gray in the east. The stars were fading. Ellie shot to her feet, her body stiff and cold. She tried to smooth her skirts, pinching her cheeks to bring some color back into her face. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs as the train chugged into the station, great clouds of steam billowing across the platform. This had to be it. This had to be the one. The doors hissed open. Passengers began to step out, a family with sleepy children, an old couple, moving slowly, a man in a sharp business suit. Ellie stood on her tiptoes, her eyes scanning every single face, a desperate prayer on her lips. The train emptied. The conductor shouted, "All aboard!" and the doors began to close. Still, no Garrett. Her shoulders slumped. The train pulled away with a groan of metal, taking the last of her hope with it. Her father had been right. It was all for nothing. He wasn't coming back. And then she heard it. A sound that wasn't the train. Hoofbeats. A lone rider was coming from the east, a perfect silhouette against the rising sun. As the figure grew closer, Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She knew that shape. She would know it anywhere. The easy way he sat in the saddle like he was born there. It was him. Garrett Quinn pulled his horse to a stop right at the edge of the platform. He looked different. His face was harder, carved by the sun and the wind. He was leaner, but somehow stronger. A scar she'd never seen before cut a pale line across his left cheek. But his eyes. Those sage-green eyes were exactly the same. They stared at each other for a long moment, the 2 years of silence stretching between them like a canyon. Then Garrett swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the wooden platform with a solid final thud. His spurs jingled as he walked toward her, his steps steady, purposeful. He stopped just a breath away from her. She could smell the road on him, leather, horse, and the clean, sharp scent of the open range. "You waited," he said. His voice was deeper now, rougher than she remembered. Ellie just nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a second near her cheek, then dropping away. I thought you'd have given up on me." "I promised," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The first golden rays of sunrise washed over them as Garrett finally closed the last inch of distance between them. This time, when his hand came up to cup her face, he didn't hesitate. "I crossed mountains and deserts to get back to you, Ellie," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I fought, and I bled, and I nearly died. But I made it. And now you're mine, if you'll still have me." The words were so possessive, so certain, yet filled with a raw vulnerability that made her heart ache. "I've always been yours, Garrett Quinn." When he kissed her, it was like the world snapping back into focus. It was like coming home, his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her tight against him, as if he was afraid she'd vanish into thin air. It was in that moment, locked in his embrace, that she knew nothing else mattered. He was here. He was real. But as he held her, a small, cold thought pricked at the edge of her joy. Fought and bled, nearly died. His journey had been far more than just a cattle drive. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat from the doorway of his office. He had a knowing, gentle smile on his face. "Reckon your wait wasn't in vain after all, Miss Morgan." Garrett pulled back just a little, but kept one arm wrapped firmly around Ellie's waist, staking his claim. "Thank you for looking after her, sir," he said. "Been keeping this safe for you, too," the station master said, pulling a folded telegram from his pocket. "Came yesterday afternoon, but the lady was determined not to move from that spot." Garrett took the paper, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. As he read it, his expression cleared, replaced by a slow-spreading grin. "It's from my partner. In Wyoming," he explained, looking down at Ellie. "Our cattle shipment arrived. We're in business." He looked so proud, so triumphant. "We did it, Ellie. Everything I promised you, it's all coming true." "Tell me everything," she said, her voice full of a million questions. She led him to the bench where she'd spent her long night. "Where have you been? Why did the letters stop?" Garrett sat beside her, taking both her hands in his. His grip was strong, reassuring. "I've got a lot to tell you," he said, his smile fading slightly. "And some of it ain't pretty. But first, there's something I need to know." He paused, his sage-green eyes searching her face. "Your father, is he still set against me?" Ellie's smile faltered. The happy bubble of their reunion popped, pricked by the cold reality of her life back home. "He is," she said quietly. He told me if I came to meet you, I shouldn't bother coming back to the ranch. Garrett's jaw tightened, the muscle flexing under his skin. I was afraid of that. He took a deep breath. But I'm not the same man who left here, Ellie. I've got land now. Good land, in Wyoming territory. I'm starting a proper ranch. Your father can't say I have nothing to offer you anymore. It was never about what you have, Garrett, she said, squeezing his hands. It's about who he thinks you are. A cowboy with wandering in his blood, as he says. But I'm not a child anymore, she added, her own voice gaining strength. I can make my own choices. Garrett looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw the woman she had become. A woman who had waited 2 years for him, defying her own family. You're right about that, he said softly. You're all grown up, Elizabeth Morgan. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. The sun was higher now, chasing the last of the shadows from the platform. Which is why I'm asking you right now. Will you come with me, be my wife, build a life with me on land that's ours? Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment she had dreamed of for 730 long days. But the dream hadn't included the look on her father's face, the threat in his voice. My family. Garrett. I can't just leave them. I'm not asking you to choose today, he said quickly, seeing the conflict in her eyes. I've got some business in town. It'll take a few days. That's time enough for me to speak to your father, man to man. Hope, fragile but bright, blossomed in her chest. You'd do that? Even knowing how he feels? Ellie, he said, and his smile was back, full of confidence. For you, I'd face down the devil himself. But even with his confident smile, Ellie could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew this was a battle he might not win. Now, he said, his tone shifting. Let me get you home before your mama starts to worry. As they rode double on Garrett's horse, heading toward the Morgan ranch, Ellie leaned back against his solid chest. She closed her eyes, trying to memorize the feeling of his arms around her, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her back. Whatever came next, they would face it. The longest night of her life was over. Dawn had brought him back to her. But as they rode, she couldn't shake the image of that pale, thin scar on his cheek. It was a mark of the life he'd lived without her, a story he hadn't fully told. The Morgan ranch appeared as they crested a small rise, and Ellie's heart sank a little. It looked smaller, more tired than she remembered. The white paint on the house was peeling, faded to a dull gray. The pastures held cattle, but not nearly as many as they once had. The drought years had been cruel. Your father's herd is down, Garrett observed, his voice carefully neutral. It's been hard, Ellie admitted. Last winter was brutal. We lost nearly a third of them to the cold. Garrett's arms tightened around her for a brief moment. All the more reason he should listen to what I have to say. As they got closer, the front door of the house opened, and her mother came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Emily Morgan's face was a rapid-fire series of emotions. Shock, then relief, then a deep, worried uncertainty as she took in the sight of Garrett Quinn. Elizabeth Grace Morgan, her mother called out, her voice sharp with worry. We've been worried sick. Garrett helped Ellie slide down from the horse before dismounting himself. He stood tall beside her as they walked toward the house, his presence a solid, comforting wall. Mama, you remember Garrett Quinn, Ellie said, trying to keep her own voice steady. Emily Morgan's gaze softened, but only a little. Mr. Quinn, you've returned. Yes, ma'am, Garrett said, his voice respectful. I keep my promises. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. Is Mr. Morgan around? I'd like to speak with him. George is in the barn, her mother said, her eyes flicking back and forth between Garrett and her daughter. Ellie, maybe you should come inside while the men talk. Ellie felt Garrett tense beside her. Actually, Mama, she said, finding a new resolve, I'd like to be present. This concerns my future, too. Before her mother could argue, the big barn door swung open with a creak. Her father, George Morgan, stood there, a pitchfork in his hand. He stopped dead when he saw Garrett. His face, already weathered by years of hard work, darkened like a thundercloud. Quinn. The single word was loaded with 2 years of anger and resentment. Mr. Morgan. Garrett didn't flinch. He stepped forward, putting himself between Ellie and her father, and extended his hand. I've come back to make good on what I promised before I left. George Morgan stared at the offered hand as if it were a snake, then let his eyes travel up to Garrett's face. He didn't take it. And what promise was that? To break my daughter's heart? To make her wait while you gallivanted all over the territories, not even bothering to send a letter? George, please, Emily said, her voice a quiet plea from the porch. Let's at least hear what the young man has to say. Garrett let his hand drop to his side, but his gaze didn't waver. Sir, I promised I'd become a man worthy of your daughter, and I've done that. I've got land in Wyoming. Good grazing land with water rights. I've got a herd started, a house built. I came back to ask for Ellie's hand, proper and respectful. George's expression didn't change. 2 years, without so much as a word. I wrote, Garrett interrupted, his voice sharp, before catching himself and lowering it. I wrote every month, until last fall. Our camp was raided by rustlers. I was laid up for months with this. He pointed to the scar on his cheek. Couldn't hold a pen, let alone get on a horse. Ellie gasped. This was new. He hadn't said anything about rustlers at the station. Her father's stance shifted almost imperceptibly. If there was one thing George Morgan understood, it was the brutal reality of the frontier. The pitchfork in his hand lowered by an inch. You have proof? Of this property? He asked, his voice a low growl. Yes, sir, Garrett said, unflinching. Deeds in my saddlebag, and a bank draft showing my holdings. I'm not asking to take Ellie away with nothing. I can provide for her now, better than I could have 2 years ago. George Morgan was silent for a long, heavy moment. He looked from Garrett's determined face to his daughter's pleading one. Finally, he seemed to make a decision. Come inside, he said, his voice still gruff. We'll discuss this like civilized folk. Relief washed over Ellie, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot. But it was a start. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Over coffee, her mother brewed with shaking hands. Garrett laid out his story. He spoke of a long cattle drive to Kansas, of saving every penny. He told them about partnering with an older, experienced rancher who saw potential in him. He described building a successful operation from the ground up. He told them how the old rancher had died the previous year, leaving Garrett the sole owner of everything they had built. Then his voice grew quiet. He spoke of the raid, a brutal, violent attack by cattle rustlers that had left 4 of his men dead and him with a wound that nearly killed him. He described the long, painful months of recovery, unable to write, unable to travel, tormented by the thought of Ellie waiting, not knowing if he was alive or dead. I wanted to come back sooner, he said, his eyes finding Ellie's across the table. Every day I couldn't send word to you felt like a special kind of torture. But I had to be sure. I had to be sure I could offer you more than just promises this time. Her father took the papers Garrett offered, the deeds, the bank drafts, and examined them with a critical, experienced eye. He held them up to the light, studying the signatures, the seals. Wyoming's still wild country, he said finally, his tone having lost its sharpest edge. It is, Garrett agreed, but it's good country, the kind of country a man can build something on, something that lasts. Emily Morgan, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke. And what about a family, Mr. Quinn? Is it a place for raising children? Garrett's eyes met Ellie's for a fleeting second, a silent promise passing between them. Yes, ma'am, he said, turning back to her mother. Our nearest neighbors? They have 5 little ones. There's a school being built in the spring, and there's talk of a proper church going up by summer. George Morgan folded the papers neatly and handed them back to Garrett. You've done well for yourself, Quinn. I'll give you that. He looked over at his daughter, and for the first time since Garrett's arrival, his expression softened. But Ellie is all we have. Her happiness. It means everything to us. I understand that, sir, Garrett said, his voice earnest and true. It means everything to me, too. That's why I'm here, asking for your blessing. I love your daughter, and with or without your permission, I aim to make her my wife. The room fell dead silent. Ellie held her breath. The clock on the mantel ticked, each sound like a hammer blow. Finally, George Morgan let out a long, slow sigh. You'll stay for dinner, he said. It wasn't a question. We've got a lot more to discuss before I make any decisions. It wasn't the yes Ellie had prayed for, but it wasn't the no she had feared. As Garrett rode into town to get a room at the hotel, promising to return the next day, a fragile hope began to mend the broken pieces of her heart. The next few days were a strange dance of negotiation and cautious truce. George Morgan, a man who respected hard work above all else, started to see Garrett not as the boy who left, but as the man who had returned. They talked cattle prices and ranching techniques, finding a common language in the hard-bitten realities of their trade. Emily Morgan watched her daughter, saw the light that had been missing for 2 years return to her eyes, and her heart began to soften. On the 3rd evening, after a long day spent with Garrett helping him mend a stretch of broken fence, George Morgan seemed to come to a decision. The family was sitting on the porch, the air cool and smelling of spring. I've been thinking, George said into the comfortable silence. That land of yours in Wyoming, how many head of cattle could it support? Garrett sat up straighter. At least 500, sir. Once we clear the south pasture, more, if the water holds through the summer. George nodded slowly, thoughtfully. And what would you say to a partnership? Ellie froze, the teacup in her hand rattling in its saucer. Her father never took partners. Ever. Garrett looked just as stunned. Sir, times are changing, Quinn, George said, looking out at his own depleted pastures. This land, it's not what it used to be. Maybe it's time I started thinking about new possibilities. He glanced at his wife, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Besides, I'm not getting any younger. If my daughter's heart is set on going to Wyoming, well, maybe her mother and I should consider a change of scenery too. The meaning behind his words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. He wasn't just giving his blessing, he was offering to uproot their entire lives, to merge their 2 families, their 2 futures, into one. Garrett stood up, his face a mixture of shock and gratitude. He extended his hand to the older man. I'd be honored, sir. Truly honored. This time George Morgan took his hand and shook it firmly. Don't you make me regret this, son. I won't, sir, Garrett said, his voice thick. You have my word. Ellie flew into her father's arms, tears of pure joy streaming down her face. Thank you, Papa. Thank you. Later that night, as Garrett was getting ready to ride back to his hotel, Ellie walked with him to the barn. The sky was a brilliant canopy of stars. I can't believe it, she whispered, her voice full of wonder. Everything is happening so fast. Not fast enough, Garrett said, pulling her into his arms in the shadows of the barn. I've waited 2 years for you, Ellie. I don't want to wait another day. His kiss was hungry, full of all the time they had lost. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. Marry me next week, he said, his voice urgent. The circuit preacher will be in town. We can be husband and wife before we head to Wyoming. Yes, Ellie whispered, the word a prayer she'd been holding in for years. 1,000 times, yes. The week passed in a blur of joyful preparations. News of the engagement spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, and the small town rallied around them. Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress, worked day and night to alter Ellie's mother's old wedding dress. Mr. Holloway, beaming with pride over his role in their reunion, offered the station's little garden for the ceremony. It felt like a fairy tale. The night before the wedding, Ellie sat with her mother in her childhood bedroom, packing a trunk for her new life. "Are you afraid?" her mother asked softly. "Of marrying Garrett? Never," Ellie said with a smile. "Of the life ahead. Wyoming is a hard place, Ellie." "I know it won't be easy, Mama," she said, "but nothing worth having ever is. You taught me that." Her mother's eyes glistened with tears. "I see the way he looks at you," she said, "like you're the sun and the moon. I'm happy for you, my darling. And your father. He's already drawing up plans for the Morgan and Quinn Cattle Company. I suspect we'll be following you out there before the first snow falls." The wedding day was perfect. The sun shone brightly in a clear blue sky. As Ellie walked down the makeshift aisle on her father's arm, she saw Garrett waiting for her. He stood tall and proud in a new suit, but it was his eyes she was focused on. Those sage green eyes were filled with so much love, so much certainty, it felt like her heart might burst. Their vows were sacred promises, sealing their futures together. The celebration afterwards was a joyous blur of dancing and laughter. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over everything, Garrett pulled her aside. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn?" he whispered in her ear. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied. But as she leaned into his embrace, a man she didn't recognize was talking to her father near the punch bowl. He was a stranger, with a hard face and a silver star pinned to his vest. The man with the star was a U.S. Marshal, just passing through town. Ellie watched as her father pointed in their direction. The Marshal nodded, his eyes lingering on Garrett for a moment too long before he turned and left the party. A cold knot of unease tightened in Ellie's stomach. "Who was that?" she asked Garrett later, trying to sound casual. Garrett glanced over his shoulder. "Don't know. Never seen him before." But his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The moment was fleeting, quickly lost in the joy of the evening, but it stuck in her mind like a burr. 3 days later, they were on the platform, ready to board the westbound train to Wyoming. Her parents were there, their faces a mixture of sadness and excitement. "We'll see you in a few months," her father boomed, clapping Garrett on the shoulder. "The Morgan and Quinn Cattle Company is counting on you." As the train pulled away, Ellie saw the marshal again. He was standing at the far end of the platform, watching their train disappear. He wasn't smiling. The journey to Wyoming was long, the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels a constant companion. At first it was exciting. They'd sit for hours, planning their future, the ranch, the house they would build, the children they would have. But as the miles stretched on, a subtle change came over Garrett. He grew quiet, watchful. He would sit by the window, not looking at the passing scenery, but scanning the horizon, as if he were looking for something, or someone. One evening, as the train was taking on water at a small, dusty stop, Ellie saw him talking to the conductor. Their conversation was low and urgent. When Garrett returned to their compartment, his face was pale. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, too quickly. "Just asking how much longer till we get there." But Ellie had seen the look on the conductor's face. It was a look of warning. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to Garrett's restless breathing beside her. The story he had told her family, the story of the cattle drive, the partner, the rustlers. It had been so perfect, so neat. But life wasn't neat. The scar on his face, the marshal at the station, his edginess on the train. They were loose threads in a story that was starting to unravel. They arrived in Wyoming under a vast, empty sky. The town was little more than a collection of rough-hewn buildings and muddy streets. It was stark and desolate, so different from the green valleys of Montana. "The ranch is a few miles out of town," Garrett said, his voice strained. It's still a work in progress." The ride out was silent. The land was flat and unforgiving, stretching to the horizon in every direction. There was no sign of the bustling operation he had described, no neighboring farms, no schoolhouse being built. There was nothing. Then she saw it. A small, lonely cabin sitting in the middle of the vast emptiness. It was barely more than a shell, the wood raw and new. A small, hastily built corral held a few dozen head of cattle. This was it. This was the dream. "Garrett," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where is everything? The house you built? Your partner's homestead?" Garrett slid off his horse, not meeting her eyes. He stood there, his shoulders slumped, a stranger in the clothes of the man she thought she knew. There's no partner, Ellie," he said, his voice cracking. "There never was." The world tilted on its axis. "What are you talking about? The deeds, the bank drafts? My father saw them. They're real enough," he said, finally looking at her. The love in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow shame. "The land is mine. The money is real. But it's not from any cattle drive." He took a ragged breath. "There was a raid, Ellie, just like I said. But we weren't the victims. We were the rustlers." The air grew thin, hard to breathe. "You? And who else?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. "My partner," he said, the word tasting like poison. "And a few others. We hit a few ranches, made some good money. We were going to go our separate ways, start clean, but the last raid, it went bad. Men started shooting. My partner, he got killed. And I got this." He touched the scar on his cheek. The story he'd told her father was a lie, twisted and reshaped to make him the hero. But he wasn't the hero. He was the villain. "The 4 men who died," she said, her voice a dead whisper. "They weren't your men, were they? They were ranchers defending their homes." He couldn't answer. He just looked at the dirt, the confident man she married crumbling into dust before her very eyes. She had married a thief, a liar, and a killer. Her mind reeled. Her family. They had sold parts of their land. They were packing their lives into wagons, heading toward this lie, this empty patch of dirt bought with stolen money. "My father," she choked out. "He's coming here. He's invested everything." "I know," Garrett said, his voice breaking. "I was a fool. I thought I could build it all before he got here. I thought I could make the lie real. I just wanted to be the man you deserved." He was a monster, but he was a monster who had looked at her with love in his eyes. He had ridden into the sunrise to find her. He had faced down her father for her. Which one was the real Garrett Quinn? The question was a razor blade in her heart. And then she remembered the marshal. He wasn't just passing through. He was hunting. He was hunting them. "They're coming for you, aren't they?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I saw a telegram at the last station, a marshal from Montana asking about a gang of rustlers, describing me. He's not far behind." They stood there, in the vast, crushing silence of the prairie, the truth a gaping chasm between them. Her fairy tale had become a nightmare. She was stranded hundreds of miles from home, married to a wanted man with the law closing in. He had built their entire future on a foundation of blood and lies, and he had dragged her and her entire family down with him. He saw the look in her eyes, the horror, the betrayal. He knew it was over. The dream was dead. "There's a loose floorboard," he said, his voice hollow. "Under the bed. The rest of the money is there. It's a lot, Ellie. More than enough." He took a step back from her, creating a distance that felt like 1,000 miles. "You take it. You ride east. Don't stop until you get back to Silver Creek. Tell your father I died, a riding accident, a fever, anything. Tell him the partnership is off, but the land is yours. Sell it. Start over. Don't let my mess ruin your life, too." It was an out, a final desperate act of love from a man who had nothing left to give but a confession and stolen cash. He was trying to save her, even as his own life was collapsing. For a moment, she thought about it. She could run. She could erase him, pretend this nightmare never happened. She could go home. But what about the men he killed? The families he ruined? What about the justice they deserved? Her father had taught her that a Morgan never breaks a promise. But he had also taught her that a Morgan always does what is right, no matter how hard it is. Taking that money would be just another lie, another stone in the foundation he had built. She didn't move toward the cabin. She just stood there, watching him. And in the distance, she saw it. A small cloud of dust on the horizon, growing larger. They were coming. Garrett saw it too. He looked from the dust cloud back to her face. He saw the resolve there, the choice she had made. He gave a single sad nod of understanding. He didn't run. He didn't reach for the gun on his hip. He just waited. As the U.S. Marshal and his posse rode up to the lonely cabin, their horses circling the lie Garrett had built, he turned and walked out to meet them. He raised his hands slowly, his face grim but resigned. Before they took him, he looked back at Ellie one last time. His eyes were not the eyes of a thief or a killer. They were the eyes of the boy she had fallen in love with, the boy who had promised her the world and gotten lost trying to find it. She met his gaze, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She had done the right thing, but it had cost her everything. Months later, Ellie stood on a familiar platform, Silver Creek Station. Her father stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. They hadn't moved to Wyoming. They had stayed, using the last of their savings to rebuild their own herd, to breathe life back into their own land. They were survivors. A train pulled into the station, hissing steam. She watched the passengers get off, but she wasn't looking for a specific face. She was just watching, waiting, not for a man to rescue her, but for her own future to arrive. The waiting was different now. It wasn't filled with desperate hope or girlish dreams. It was quiet, strong, and patient. She had been a girl who waited for a cowboy to come home at dawn. Now she was a woman who stood on her own 2 feet, ready to face whatever came with the rising sun. Her story wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something more real, and maybe something better. It was a story of survival. What do you think? Did Ellie make the right choice, or should she have run away with Garrett and the money? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of love, lies, and justice on the frontier, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the Old West.